Hey everybody, I'm Will Martin, and I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a story that might sound familiar. It was in the news not more than a few weeks ago. It's a sad story and one that requires reflection by every healthcare provider, including our EMS partners who respond to dangerous and unpredictable events every hour of every day in the United States. We'll begin by talking about the patient, or perhaps maybe we should call him the victim. I don't want to use the man's name because while it's important that he be recognized, I want to focus on the story in the hopes that it resonates with those of us who are first responders in medical emergencies. As someone who's responded as a paramedic, both paid and volunteer, for nearly 25 years, I can attest that this course of events is not unique. The event started as a 911 call for the police. A female, presumably a significant other, called the police concerned about the mental status of the patient. He had a known history of alcohol abuse as well as other substance abuse. His behavior was characterized as sleepy and difficult to arouse. It's possible that he had a criminal history known to the responding police officers, but in some cases this is, not uncommon. When the police arrived at the single-family residence, they were greeted by the female who advised the police of the patient's odd behavior. I believe she had assumed he was heavily under the influence of alcohol or some other substance. She was requesting that officers escort him off the property as he may have had a history of domestic violence. Again, this may not be true, but it's not unusual. When the police were granted permission to enter the residence, they proceeded towards the back of the house where they found the patient in a lethargic and confused state on the bed. He was not combative, but was clearly suffering from some form of debilitation. The officers attempted to communicate with the patient and offered to help him stand. When it was clear that he could neither stand nor effectively communicate, the police identified the need for a medical evaluation. They contacted their dispatch and requested an EMS unit respond. After several minutes, the EMS unit arrived, and this is where the real story begins. As I said, I worked in EMS as a paid paramedic in an urban setting for several years while also serving in a volunteer capacity for more than 2 decades. I've seen all types of people enter and exit the EMS field. Some get into it and just treat it as a job. Others found a calling and a passion for the excitement of being a first responder and the gratification of helping others. For those who jumped into EMS because it was a job, they usually didn't last very long. They found something else to do after a while. They self-selected themselves out of the picture. For the dedicated EMS provider, their passion for the job was directly affected by many things, including work-life balance, working conditions, and the sheer volume of sadness and tragedy that they encounter on a daily basis. Some can seemingly go on endlessly responding to emergency calls and never seem bothered by what they see, but look closely at them. They have that detached stare that allows them to go through the motions without the emotional investment. And mind you, they weren't always that way. But there comes a point when you've been there more times than you can count, hearing the same story over and over, often hearing lie after lie about what happened that necessitated an EMS response. This type of EMS worker actually does the job well enough and will still lend a helping hand to those patients who truly need compassion. The other type of EMS worker is similarly jaded in some ways, but has adopted a sense of superiority towards those who call for help. And to be honest, this is far too common. It also stems from an overwhelming amount of day-to-day sadness and tragedy, as I've said before, but rather than detach themselves, this type of EMS worker takes what they think is the moral high ground and looks down on the patient with pity and sometimes even disdain. This is what may have happened to our patient in this story. When EMS arrived, they proceeded to eyeball the patient from the doorway and determined that this patient, with whom I think they were familiar, was under the influence of a substance, presumably alcohol. It seemed like this EMS crew had been there several times before. On this particular night, the EMS crew was not going to engage much with this patient. They had prematurely concluded that he was drunk or he was high or both. And in order to just get the train moving and get this call over with, they would just transport him to the hospital. But what they weren't going to do was assist him to the ambulance with a stretcher or carry him or use some other type of device. This patient was going to walk to the ambulance. The EMS crew seemed familiar with the police officers that were on the scene, and that's typical. Nowadays, police accompany EMS on most calls for medical help. That wasn't always the case, and in fact, for most of my paid experience as a paramedic, we only saw the police when they called us or when we specifically requested their presence. We were nevertheless a tight group. We were often invited to each other's work parties, and we looked at each other as being on the same team. It was, in some ways, us against the world. And I felt then and feel today that it's still a healthy relationship. Each has to rely upon the other when you're standing in a stranger's living room or bedroom at 3 a.m. and you don't know who else is in the house or whether there's a firearm under the pillow. In this tragic case, the EMS crew simply made a determination of the patient's condition without performing even a basic physical assessment. Now, I'll admit that when you've amassed years of experience, much of your examination of the patient can occur by simply observing and speaking with the patient. This occurs both out in the field as well as in the emergency department. Experience and Gestalt are important contributors to the patient assessment. What was missing from this patient's assessment was probably both experience, Gestalt, and some compassion, along with a healthy dose of skepticism. You see, even though you may really believe that you've figured out the patient's problem from a few sentences of interaction in the doorway, you might just be wrong. And that skepticism of your own ability to reach a rapid conclusion is what keeps many of us from ignoring warning signs of impending doom. This EMS crew may have experienced to some degree, but what they haven't seen is what happens when an alcoholic suffers an withdrawal, an alcohol seizure withdrawal. Alcohol withdrawal seizures can happen without warning, and once occurring, they're life-threatening. I believe that this is what was about to occur to this patient after they essentially dragged him out of the house, down the steps, and ultimately face down on the ambulance stretcher. Shortly after placing him on the stretcher, bad things happened. And those bad things were leading to an unrecoverable, life-threatening medical event. As a former paramedic and an emergency department provider for 27 years, I know what I don't know, and it's a lot. I know that no matter how under control a situation seems to be, we're dealing with a human being whose biology is often unpredictable. This poor patient did not survive his encounter with EMS that night. There's not much to say to the EMS crew that responded to his call for help that night, but for all other EMS providers out there who are responding to one tragedy after another, be careful. You're dealing with the most unpredictable of organisms, the human. Don't let yourself get trapped by your own confidence. And as soon as you get too comfortable, bad things are probably going to follow very soon. I know this. Every time I thought I'd finally had this whole emergency medicine thing figured out, something would come along to humble me big time. I'm grateful that I've never let my pseudo-confidence hurt anyone. I've never been sued, knock on wood, and it would devastate me if it occurred. The public often doesn't take into account the toll the job takes on a first responder, whether it be EMS, law enforcement, or fire. These people are seeing sadness, filth, tragedy, and sickness on a daily and typically an hourly basis. They see where the tragedy occurs, they see what it looks like, what it sounds like, and really what it smells like. That experience is not easily translated to the citizen who only watches the news and sees the flashing lights on the headlines. Our military veterans have rightly received some recognition for the horrors witnessed on the battlefield. For our EMS, law, and fire personnel, that battlefield is a daily occurrence until you're fortunate enough to get your 20 years and can retire. I'd like to know what you think about what I've said. I'd like to hear your comments. If you appreciate what I've said, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking it. And I'll talk to you on the next video. Thanks.